The ink was still wet on the marriage contract when Sadie realized she had made a terrible mistake. Not the contract itself. That had been her father's doing, his careful handwriting looping across parchment the color of old bone, binding her name to Lord Cedric Vane before she had turned 22, before she had understood what it truly meant to be promised to a man who collected things. Horses, land, women. She had been the last acquisition before his ambitions shifted to something far darker than property. No. The mistake she had made tonight was trusting that the dead stayed silent. She stood at the edge of the narrow corridor behind the great hall, her back pressed against cold stone, her fingers curled around a folded letter she had not meant to find. The wax seal had already been broken. Not by her. Someone else had read it first, had refolded it carelessly, had tucked it back beneath the loose hearthstone in Cedric's study, as though it were nothing, as though the words inside were not a sentence. The Omega girl will not survive the winter solstice ritual. You have my word. Once the bloodline transfer is complete, the Vane pack will hold the Northern Territories unchallenged. Burn this after reading. It had not been burned. Sadie's chest rose and fell in shallow, controlled increments. She had read it 3 times, standing in the firelight of Cedric's empty study, while the wedding celebration continued 2 floors below. Laughter, music, the clinking of goblets, the sound of people celebrating a union that was, in truth, a scheduled death. She had been married for 6 hours. She was going to be dead before the next full moon. The letter was signed with a name she recognized, Elder Prosper. The man who had officiated her wedding ceremony that very afternoon, who had pressed her hands between his and called her blessed, who had smiled at her with small, wet eyes that she had always found unsettling, and now understood exactly why. She breathed through her nose and smelled it again, beneath the stone dust and torch smoke, beneath the wool of her own wedding dress still stiff with embroidery thread, beneath everything, the faint sweetness of night bloom extract. Subtle, almost kind, in the way poison sometimes was. It had been in the ceremonial wine, the cup that only she had drunk from. Her stomach turned, not from fear. She had moved past fear in the 30 seconds between reading the letter and pressing herself into this corridor, but from the specific, nauseating grief of understanding. She thought of how Cedric had watched her drink it, how he had smiled, how he had touched her cheek afterward and called her beautiful, and she had believed, fool that she was, that perhaps she had misjudged him. Perhaps the coldness she had always sensed in him was simply the manner of powerful men. Perhaps she had been unfair. She had not been unfair. She had been blind. Sadie pushed off the wall and moved. She did not run, not yet. Running inside the hall would draw attention, and she was still wearing white, still trailing a hem that caught on every uneven flagstone, still recognizably the new Lady Vane being offered toasts in the room 20 feet away. She walked with the careful, deliberate pace of a woman who needed air, which was not entirely a performance. Her lungs felt tight. Her fingers were cold in a way that had nothing to do with the draft coming through the high windows. She needed to think. She needed to think fast. The night bloom extract, if that's what it was, acted slowly. It was a ceremonial poison, designed for ritual use, not immediate collapse. She had perhaps until dawn before the first serious symptoms arrived. Maybe less, depending on how much had been in the cup and how much her body had already absorbed. She had no healer she trusted inside these walls. The pack physician answered to Cedric. The elder women of the household had been handpicked by Cedric's mother, a woman who had looked at Sadie on the day of their introduction with the flat, assessing gaze of someone measuring a garment they intended to discard. She had no allies here. What she had was a letter, a body slowly being poisoned, a marriage that was a trap, and... She pressed her palm against the small purse stitched inside the lining of her underskirt. 43 gold coins that had been her mother's, hidden from Cedric's inventory of her belongings because she had sewn them in herself the night before the wedding. Some instinct she hadn't fully understood then driving her hands in the candlelight. She understood it now. The servants' corridor took her to the back of the kitchen, which was still hot and loud with the aftermath of the feast. No one looked at her twice. A young woman in a white dress moving through steam and clatter, her braid coming loose at the nape, her jaw set. Outside, the night was cold and damp, the kind of autumn cold that settled into wool immediately and stayed there. She pulled her cloak from the peg where she had left it before the ceremony. Another instinct, another small preparation she had not let herself examine, and walked into the courtyard. The stable was lit by a single lantern. The groom was asleep against a post, his chin on his chest, a half-empty flask tilted in his hand. Sadie saddled her own mare, a gray named Birch, who she had owned since before her father's debts had swallowed everything else, and did it quietly, efficiently, with hands that only trembled once, and then stopped. She did not let herself think about what she was leaving. There was nothing to leave. There was only what she was riding toward, which was currently nothing, which was the open dark and the road north and a problem she had not yet solved. She needed an antidote. She needed protection. She needed, by the laws of the Northern Territories that Elder Prosper himself had drafted 20 years ago in a council session she had studied as a girl, a recognized mate who could contest the bloodline transfer on her behalf. The law was archaic, and had been written to protect pack heirs from exactly this kind of ritual theft. The taking of power through blood ceremony from an Omega, who had no Alpha to speak for her claim. Cedric had been counting on her having no one. Birch's hooves struck the cobblestones of the outer road, and the wedding music faded behind them. Sadie leaned forward, let the mare find her rhythm, and stared at the darkness ahead with the cold, furious clarity of someone who has just discovered that survival requires becoming a completely different person than she was an hour ago. She had until dawn. She needed a husband. She needed one tonight. The town of Ashvale sat at the base of the northern pass, 3 miles from the Vane estate, and it was the only settlement close enough to matter. It was also, by reputation, the kind of place where desperate people made impossible arrangements, where debts were renegotiated under tavern lanterns, where pack law bent slightly in the smoke and shadow, where strangers passed through on roads that didn't appear on any official map. She had 43 gold coins, and a body that was slowly dying. Someone in Ashvale would take the coins. Someone would sign a document. Someone would stand before a local officiant, speak the words, and give her the legal standing she needed to survive until morning. And then she would find a healer. And then she would find a way to dismantle everything Cedric Vane had built on the bones of her future. She told herself it was a reasonable plan. She told herself that right up until she rode into Ashvale and found it burning. Palavras. 312. Peço desculpas. A contagem ficou abaixo do exigido. Vou completar o bloco agora para atingir as 802,000 palavras. Not the whole town. Just the east quarter. 2 buildings near the crossroads, their rooftops bleeding orange into the low clouds, the smell of burning pine resin and something sharper, chemical, reaching her before the sound did. There were people in the street, some running, some standing still with the particular frozen quality of those who had already understood that running would not help. A cart had been overturned. Horses she did not recognize, large, dark-saddled war horses, were tied to the post outside the inn. Sadie pulled Birch to a stop at the edge of the firelight and assessed. The horses bore no pack insignia she recognized. The men standing near them wore dark leather, travel-worn, armed not with the ceremonial guard weapons she was used to seeing, but with the practical, unadorned blades of people who fought regularly and did not care how it looked. There were perhaps 8 of them visible, possibly more inside. They were not burning the buildings. She revised that quickly, watching. They were containing something that was already burning, working a perimeter with the focused efficiency of soldiers who had done this before. A woman stumbled out of the inn doorway and was caught by one of them, steadied, directed toward the far side of the street. He didn't grab her. He guided her, 2 fingers at her elbow, a gesture so brief and careful, it almost looked gentle against the backdrop of smoke and chaos. Sadie's eyes moved past him to the inn's entrance. And stopped. He was standing in the doorway. Not entering, not exiting, simply standing, the way a wall stands, with that quality of absolute permanence that made the space around him reorganize itself accordingly. Tall. Broad through the shoulders in a way that the dark fur-lined cloak only partially obscured. His hair was pulled back in tight braids, dark against his neck, and his jaw was set with the particular stillness of a man who was not reacting to the fire, because the fire was not the most important thing in the room. He was looking at a map, in a burning town. At the entrance to a collapsing inn, with smoke threading past him, he was reading a map with the focused attention of someone who had nothing to fear from the world around him, because the world had already learned not to test him. Sadie did not know who he was, but she knew, with the bone-deep instinct that had kept her alive through 6 years in the Vane household, that he was the most dangerous person in Asheville tonight. She also had 37 gold coins in her underskirt. She had miscounted earlier. And approximately 6 hours before the night bloom extract currently working through her blood became something she could not manage with willpower alone. The first symptom would be warmth in the hands. She had already felt it twice. She dismounted. Tied Birch to a post away from the smoke, straightened her wedding dress, which was absurd and white and wildly inappropriate for every aspect of this situation, and walked toward the man in the doorway. She did not let herself hesitate. "I need to speak with you," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she deserved. "Privately. It will take less than 10 minutes, and I will pay for your time." He looked up from the map. His eyes were the color of deep water in poor light. Not quite gray, not quite blue. Something in between that caught the firelight and gave nothing back. He looked at her the way a person looks at something that has appeared in an unexpected place. Not with surprise, but with the careful, unhurried attention of a mind recalibrating. He looked at her dress, at her loose braid, still threaded with the small pearl pins from the ceremony, at her cloak, plain gray wool over white silk, which told a story she hadn't meant to tell quite so loudly. "You're a long way from a wedding," he said. His voice was low, not unkind, not kind either, simply level, like ground that had not decided yet what it intended to do. "Yes," Sadie said. "That's rather the problem." He folded the map, looked at her for another moment with those still, unreadable eyes. Then he stepped back from the doorway and gestured, once, for her to enter. She walked past him into the smoke-stung air of the inn's front room, and the heat from the fire outside pressed against the back of her neck, and somewhere behind her Birch shifted against her post, and the wedding bells of the Vane estate were 3 miles away and fading, and Sadie thought, "This is either the worst decision I have ever made, or the only one that matters." She thought it was probably both. The inn smelled of tallow candles, spilled ale soaked into old wood, and beneath everything, pine smoke drifting in through the cracks around the shuttered windows. 2 of his men stood near the far wall and did not look at her, not with indifference, but with the trained discretion of soldiers who had learned when to be invisible. A third sat at the table nearest the door, a short blade resting across his knees, his eyes half closed in the way of someone who was not actually resting. The man with the braids sat across from her and said nothing. Sadie appreciated that, briefly, before she understood it was a tactic. Silence is pressure. She had seen Cedric use it on servants who owed him explanations. She set both hands flat on the table, felt the rough grain of the wood against her palms, and spoke before the silence could do its work on her. "I was married this afternoon," she said, "to Lord Cedric Vane of the Northern Vane Pack. During the ceremony, I was given poisoned wine without my knowledge. I found the letter confirming it approximately 2 hours ago." She reached into the fold of her cloak and placed the letter on the table between them. The poison is night bloom extract. It works slowly. I have until approximately dawn before the symptoms become serious, and possibly less depending on the concentration. He did not touch the letter. He looked at it, and then at her. The law of the Northern Territories, she continued, keeping her voice even, keeping her hands still, grants a recognized mate the right to contest a bloodline ritual on behalf of an Omega. Elder Prosper, whose signature is on that letter, drafted that provision himself. If I have a legal mate before dawn, the transfer cannot proceed without challenge. Cedric needs me dead and unmarked. A second marriage, even a witnessed contract, complicates everything he has arranged. You want a legal mate, the man said. It was not a question. I want a signed contract witnessed by a local officiant. I have 37 gold coins. She did not flinch saying it. She knew it was not a king's sum. She also knew it was everything she had, and shame was a luxury she could not currently afford. I need someone willing to sign before dawn. Someone with enough standing that the contract cannot be easily dismissed. She paused. You have the look of a man whose signature carries weight. Something shifted in his expression. Not humor. Not quite. But the shadow of something that had once lived near it. That's a careful way to proposition a stranger, he said. I'm not propositioning you, Sadie said. I'm making a business arrangement. There's a difference. Is there? Yes. One involves feelings. This involves paperwork and a time constraint. She met his eyes and held them. I don't need you to care about me. I need you to exist, legally, as my mate, for long enough that I can find a healer and challenge the ritual transfer. After that, the contract can be dissolved by mutual agreement. You lose nothing. You gain 37 gold coins, and whatever satisfaction there is in inconveniencing a man who poisons his wives on their wedding day. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, one of his men called something to another in a language she didn't recognize. Clipped, consonant-heavy, the dialect of the Far Eastern Territories. Show me your hands, he said. Sadie blinked. Then she turned her hands palm up on the table. He leaned forward and looked at them without touching. And she saw it before she felt it, which was somehow worse. The faint rose warmth along her fingers, barely visible, the kind of flush that looked like cold weather until you knew what you were looking for. How long has that been there? He asked. I noticed it the first time about an hour ago, she said. It faded. It came back. He sat back, looked at the letter for the first time, reading it in what seemed like a single smooth pass. His expression did not change. That stillness again, not coldness, not absence, but the quality of someone who processed catastrophe internally and showed the world only the result. He folded the letter and placed it back in front of her. The officiant in Ashvale is named Dora Ashby, he said. She lives above the grain merchant's shop, 3rd building past the well. She has witnessed pack contracts for 30 years, and her records are filed with the Northern Council. He stood. I'll send one of my men ahead to wake her. Sadie stared at him. You're agreeing. I'm solving a problem, he said, which was, she realized, not quite the same thing, and also somehow more unnerving than a simple yes. He moved toward the door, paused with his hand on the frame, and looked back at her. Can you walk, or do you need the horse? I can walk, she said, and stood to prove it, and the room tilted only slightly. He noticed. She could tell by the way he didn't say anything. The walk to Dora Ashby's door took 11 minutes. Sadie counted her steps without meaning to. The way the body accounts for itself when it knows something is wrong and tries to maintain the illusion of control. The stranger walked beside her, not close, not distant, exactly far enough to catch her if she fell without having to reach. She noticed that too. Noticed the precision of it. Dora Ashby was a small, sturdy woman of perhaps 60, with gray hair in a practical braid and the expression of someone who had been woken before dawn often enough that it no longer surprised her. She looked at Sadie's wedding dress, and then at the man beside her, and then back at Sadie with the flattened affect of a person who had seen stranger things and would likely see stranger things still. "Pack contract?" Dora asked. "Witnessed mate bond declaration," the man said. "Standard northern form. Dated tonight." Dora looked at him for a long moment with an expression Sadie could not read. Then she opened her door wider and said, "Come in then, Lord." "Cale," he said, and nothing else. Sadie's pen stopped moving above the contract. She did not know every name in every territory. She was the daughter of a minor lord from the Middle Provinces, educated well, but not comprehensively, and the world of high alpha politics had always existed at a distance from her life. But she knew that name the way anyone who had grown up in a shifter world knew it, not from having met him, not from having seen him, but from the particular way people said it, in low voices, with a pause before and after, as though the name itself needed room. Cale, the Alpha King of the West March Territories, commander of the Iron Pact, the man who had ended the border wars 6 years ago by walking alone into the enemy council and walking out again with a signed treaty and 3 fewer council members than had been present when he arrived. The man whose pack controlled more territory than the next 4 largest packs combined. The man about whom the only thing everyone agreed was that you did not want to be on the wrong side of whatever he had decided. She had just offered him 37 gold coins. Sadie set the pen down very carefully. "You didn't tell me," she said. "You didn't ask my name," Cale said. He was looking at the contract form Dora had placed on the table, reading it with the same focused attention he had given the map in the Burning Inn. "You asked if my signature carried weight. I assumed you had a reason to believe it did. I thought you were a traveling commander, a regional alpha at most. Does it change your request?" Sadie looked at the contract, looked at her hands, where the warmth was spreading now past her fingers toward her wrists, slow and inexorable as the tide, looked at the small, patient woman behind the desk, who was watching them both with the expression of someone who had agreed to witness this and would see it through, regardless of the political absurdity currently unfolding in her sitting room. "No," Sadie said. She picked the pen back up. "It doesn't change anything." She signed her name, Sadie Alara Wren, in the handwriting her governess had drilled into her at age 7, clear and deliberate, every letter finished. Cale signed beneath it without hesitation. Dora Ashby stamped the document with the Northern Council seal, recorded the date and hour in her ledger, and handed them each a witnessed copy with the brisk, efficient manner of a woman completing a task that was, in the end, simply a task. Outside, the fire in the east quarter had burned itself down to embers. The sky above Ashvale was beginning that dark preliminary shift that came before dawn. Not light yet, just the slow retirement of the deepest black. Sadie stood on the street with a contract in her hand, the Alpha King of the West March Territories beside her, and a poison moving steadily through her blood. She had done what she came to do. She had absolutely no idea what came next. "There's a healer," Cale said, already walking. 2 streets east. She knows night bloom extract. I've used her before." Sadie followed him, because there was nothing else to do, because her hands were warm to the elbow now, and the edges of her vision were beginning to soften in a way that frightened her more than anything that had happened tonight. Because she had, in the span of 2 hours, escaped a wedding, discovered a murder plot, and married the most powerful alpha in the known territories for 37 gold coins. And the night, somehow, was not finished with her yet. The healer's name was Marin, and she did not ask questions. That alone made Sadie trust her more than anyone she had met in the last 12 hours. Marin was perhaps 45, with the kind of face that had once been soft and had decided, somewhere along the way, to become useful instead. Her workroom smelled of dried yarrow, beeswax, something astringent and green that Sadie couldn't name. And beneath it, all the faint copper note of a space where blood had been treated often enough to leave a permanent memory in the walls. She took one look at Sadie's hands, pressed 2 fingers to the inside of her wrist, and said, "Sit down before you fall down." Sadie sat. Kyle stood near the door, not blocking it, simply present, in the way that seemed to be his natural state, occupying space without consuming it. Marin glanced at him once, the glance of someone confirming a familiar presence, and then ignored him entirely in the focused, purposeful way of a woman with work to do. "How much did you drink?" Marin asked, already moving between her shelves. "Half a ceremonial cup, perhaps a little more." "And when?" "Approximately 7 hours ago." Marin made a sound that was not quite reassuring. She pulled 3 different bundles from the upper shelf, a small clay jar sealed with wax, and a length of linen. "The extract compounds in the blood over time. The warmth you're feeling is the 2nd stage. 3rd stage is fever, disorientation, muscle failure. You're not there yet." She unstoppered the jar, and the smell that came out of it was sharp enough to make Sadie's eyes water, something between vinegar and pine resin and something almost floral underneath. "But you're closer than I'd like. Can you treat it? I can interrupt it." Marin measured a small amount of the liquid into a clay cup, added powdered herbs from 2 of the bundles, and stirred with a thin wooden rod. "This will make you sick for about an hour. After that, the extract starts breaking down. You'll need to sleep." She held out the cup. All of it, and quickly. Sadie drank it. It was, without question, the worst thing she had ever tasted. She got through it on stubbornness alone, set the cup down with a hand that had started trembling, and breathed through her nose until the first wave of nausea passed. "Good," Marin said, without particular warmth but with unmistakable competence. She wrapped the linen around Sadie's forearms, soaked in something cool that numbed the heat immediately, and then stepped back and looked at her with the assessing expression of a woman running calculations. "Where are you sleeping tonight?" Sadie opened her mouth and realized she had no answer. "With us," Cale said from the door. Sadie turned to look at him. There was nothing in his face that invited argument, not aggression, not command exactly, just the calm certainty of a decision that had already been made and was being communicated as a courtesy rather than a negotiation. She thought about objecting on principle, because principle was one of the few things she still had intact, and then she thought about the alternative, which was a borrowed room somewhere in Ashevale, while Cedric Vane woke to find his new wife missing, and a pack of trained hunters followed her scent across 3 miles of open road. "Fine," she said. They rode for nearly an hour before the camp appeared between the trees. Sadie had expected soldiers. She had expected the functional, spare organization of a military camp. Tents in rows, fires in prescribed positions, the smell of horses and iron, and men who had been traveling too long. What she found instead was something considerably more substantial. The camp was positioned in a natural clearing backed against a stone outcropping, sheltered from the wind and from observation from the main road. There were perhaps 40 men, but they moved with such quiet efficiency that the space felt almost peaceful. Large tents with oiled canvas, a central fire with a cooking spit, horses in a temporary paddock that had been built properly, with posts and rope, not just tied to trees. And at the edge of the clearing, set slightly apart, a tent that was noticeably larger than the others. Its entrance faced away from the main camp toward the dark tree line. Cale dismounted and handed his horse to a waiting groom without looking. The groom took the reins with the practiced ease of someone who had done it 1,000 times. Around the camp, heads turned toward Sadie, brief professional assessments, none of them lingering, and then returned to their tasks. A man approached. Broad, dark-haired, with a scar bisecting his left eyebrow, and the alert, watchful eyes of someone whose job was knowing things before other people knew them. He looked at Sadie's dress, still white, still absurd, now additionally crumpled and smoke-scented, and then at Cale, with a single raised brow that communicated a considerable volume of unspoken question. "Not now, Devon," Cale said. Devon closed his mouth, nodded, looked at Sadie one more time with the evaluating gaze of a man filing information away for later, and stepped aside. The tent Sadie was shown to was not Cale's. It was smaller, positioned near a low fire, and someone had clearly prepared it recently. The bedroll had been laid out with clean wool blankets. A basin of water sat on a folding table beside it, and a small oil lamp threw warm light across the canvas walls. The attention to those details, the blankets, the water, the lamp, struck her somewhere unguarded, because it meant someone had anticipated her need before she had expressed it, and she was not accustomed to that. She was accustomed to managing her own needs silently and hoping no one noticed. She sat on the edge of the bedroll and felt Marin's medicine begin doing what it had promised. The nausea arrived properly then, patient and thorough, and she spent the better part of an hour being quietly, miserably ill, while the camp settled around her and the sky outside turned from black to the deep gray blue of very early morning. When it passed, she felt hollowed out, empty in a way that was not entirely unpleasant. The heat in her arms had receded to almost nothing. The soft blur at the edges of her vision was gone, and what remained was the clean, exhausted clarity of a body that had been through something and survived it. She lay back against the blankets and stared at the canvas ceiling. Her name was Sadie Wren. She was 23 years old. 6 hours ago, she had been a new bride at a celebration in her honor. Now she was lying in a military camp, somewhere in the northern woods, legally married to the Alpha King of the West March territories. Her first husband presumably awake by now and furious, the poison he had put in her blood losing its hold by degrees, and somewhere in a document box in Dora Ashby's sitting room above the grain merchant's shop. A contract with both their signatures sat filed under tonight's date. She should be terrified. She was, she discovered, mostly furious. The terror would probably come later, when her body had rested enough to afford it. For now, there was only the anger, and it was remarkably clarifying. She thought of Cedric's hand on her cheek, and the warmth in his eyes and the way he had said beautiful, and the fury burned clean and even, like a well-fed fire, the kind that did not consume itself. She thought of Elder Prosper's wet smile at the altar and the words bloodline transfer in his careful handwriting, and the fire burned hotter. She was going to need to be smart. She was going to need allies, information, legal standing, and a plan. She had the legal standing now. For whatever it was worth, and with the Alpha King's name attached to it, it might be worth considerably more than she had originally calculated when she had been bargaining in the dark with a stranger she thought was a regional commander. She was still not entirely certain what to do with the scale of that. She kept turning it over, examining it from different angles. Kyle. The name that required space around it. She had offered him 37 gold coins. He had not mentioned the coins again. She was still thinking about that when the tent flap shifted and Kyle ducked inside. He was carrying a small covered bowl and a cup of something steaming, and he set them down on the folding table beside the basin without ceremony, and looked at her with that level, unhurried gaze. "You should eat before you sleep," he said. "You didn't have to. It's broth. It's not a declaration." He pulled the cover from the bowl. The smell that rose from it was simple and good. Bone broth with herbs, something roasted underneath. Her stomach, newly emptied and apparently uninterested in pride, responded immediately. She sat up and took the bowl. He did not leave. He stood near the entrance, not looming, just present. And she ate in silence that was surprisingly bearable, which she resented slightly, because it made it harder to maintain the careful distance she needed to keep between herself and anyone who had done something kind for her tonight. "You knew about the Nightbloom extract before I mentioned the symptoms," she said, when the bowl was half empty. It had been sitting in her mind, snagged on something. "You knew which healer to take me to. You've treated it before. A pause. Yes. Someone poisoned a member of your pack. He looked at her steadily. My sister. 4 years ago. Sadie was quiet for a moment. Did she survive? She did. And the person who poisoned her? Something moved across his expression, brief, contained, and entirely answer enough. She nodded slowly. I want the same outcome, she said. I want you to understand that. I didn't come to you just to survive tonight. I came to survive long enough to dismantle everything Cedric Vane and Elder Prosper have built. The ritual transfer, whatever it is, cannot complete. My blood carries something they want, and I don't yet know what, but I intend to find out. She met his eyes. I'm not asking for your help beyond what you've already given. The contract was the arrangement. But I want you to know I'm not running from this. Cal looked at her for a long moment. In the lamplight, with the noise of the camp outside reduced to low murmurs and the occasional shift of horses, the tent felt very small and very still. The bloodline transfer Elder Prosper described, he said, is not a standard northern ritual. I've heard it referenced once before, in a council report from the Eastern Territories 12 years ago. It was used to strip an heir of their lineage mark and bind it to another bloodline. He paused. It requires the carrier's death. I know, Sadie said. It also requires the carrier to be a specific kind of Omega, one with a dormant lineage mark. His gaze dropped briefly to the inside of her left wrist, and Sadie went still, because she had worn long sleeves her entire adult life, and she had thought no one outside her family knew about the mark. The pale silver-white trace of it, faint as old embroidery, that had appeared on her wrist on her 21st birthday, and that her father had covered with a linen wrap and told her never to mention. How do you know about that? She asked quietly. Because, Cale said, your pack, your real pack, before your father's debts transferred your contract to Vane, was under Iron Pact protection. Your lineage mark is registered in the Pact archive. He watched her absorb that. Cedric Vane did not buy a wife, Sadie. He acquired a key, and he was willing to destroy the lock to use it. The fire outside the tent snapped once in the wind. Sadie set the bowl down with careful, deliberate hands. The anger she had been carrying all night shifted, not away, but deeper, past the personal outrage of betrayal, and into something larger and colder, and far more focused. Then I need to know what the key opens, she said. She slept for 6 hours and woke up angry, which felt like progress. The anger was different from the night before, less raw, more structured, the kind that had found its shape while she was unconscious, and was now waiting for her with its sleeves already rolled. Sadie lay still for a moment in the gray morning light filtering through the tent canvas, and took a deliberate inventory. Hands warm but not burning, vision clear, limbs responding correctly. The hollowed-out exhaustion of the night, replaced by something that was not quite strength yet, but was at least its preliminary. Marin's treatment had held. She was alive. Cedric had tried to kill her on her wedding day, and she was alive, and that fact alone was enough to get her upright. Outside, the camp was already active. She could hear the specific sounds of a disciplined group in motion. Low voices, the ring of metal being worked, horses moving in the paddock, the smell of wood smoke and something cooking over a real fire. She smoothed her hands over the wedding dress she had slept in, which was beyond salvaging at this point, and stepped outside. Devon was waiting. Not for her specifically, it seemed. He was standing near the central fire with a cup in his hand and a sheaf of papers under his arm, reading something. But when she emerged, he looked up with the expression of a man who had been not waiting with great concentration. There are clothes, he said without preamble. In the pack trunk behind the healer's tent. Riding clothes. They'll be large but serviceable. He paused. The Alpha King asks that you join him when you're ready. No particular urgency. Sadie looked at him. How long has he been up? He didn't sleep. She absorbed that without comment and went to find the clothes. The riding clothes were indeed large, built for someone with broader shoulders and considerably more height. But there was a leather belt that cinched the tunic adequately, and the boots, stuffed with a folded cloth at the toe, were manageable. She braided her hair back tightly, stripped the pearl pins out one by one and set them in her pocket, because they were the only things she had that had belonged to her mother, and went to find Kyle. He was at the far edge of the camp, at the stone outcropping, standing over a table that had been set up against the rock face. Maps. Several of them, weighted at the corners with stones, covered in markings she didn't recognize at first, and then did. Territorial boundary markers. Iron Pact notation, the specific cartographic shorthand of pack law. Documents she had studied as a girl under a governess who had believed, against all prevailing social opinion, that women should understand the world they lived in. He looked up when she approached. Something in his expression shifted. Not much, but she was beginning to read the small adjustments in that still face. The way you learned to read weather in a landscape that didn't announce itself. You look better, he said. I feel functional, she said. That's sufficient for now. She looked at the maps. You've been working. Devon pulled the Iron Pact archive records through the night. The Northern Territorial Dispatch rider arrived an hour ago. He moved aside to let her see the primary map, and she stepped in beside him, close enough to smell wood smoke and leather and something clean underneath. Your lineage mark. I told you it was registered in the archive. What I didn't tell you last night was the full context, because you needed to sleep more than you needed information. He pointed to a section of the map. The Northern Territories, the cluster of packlands that included Vane holdings and several others. Your mother's line. Do you know your maternal ancestry past 2 generations? My grandmother was a Crestfall, Sadie said, from the Northern Highlands. Past that. She frowned. My great-grandmother, I know her name was Eileen. My father never spoke about her. I always assumed she had come from common stock, because he was sensitive about the maternal line in a way that suggested embarrassment. She wasn't common stock, Cale said. She was Eileen Dawnmere, the last keeper of the Dawnmere bloodline, which held the territorial seal of the Northern Highlands for 300 years before the pack was dissolved in the Upland Wars. He watched her face. The Dawnmere seal controls binding rights over 7 pack territories in the north, Centenas. Whoever holds the bloodline can claim arbitration authority over every territorial dispute in the region, including the border conflict that Elder Prosper and Cedric Vane have been quietly engineering for the past 4 years. Sadie was very still. They've been creating the conflict, she said slowly, so they could control the resolution. With your blood bound to Vane's line through the transfer ritual, Cedric would hold the Dawnmere seal. He could resolve the border disputes in whatever configuration he chose. 6 pack territories would effectively become subject to Vane authority. Cale's voice was level, factual, giving her the information without dressing it in performance. She appreciated that more than she could have articulated. Elder Prosper gets 3 of those territories in the political reorganization. He drafted the ritual law himself, specifically to make it legal. The scale of it settled over her slowly. Not her death as a personal cruelty, her death as a transaction. She had not been a bride. She had been a document, and Cedric had been about to sign her out of existence. My brother, she said suddenly. Kyle looked at her. I have a brother, Finn. He's 26. He's been living at the Crestfall holding in the Highlands for the past 2 years. My father sent him there before he died, supposedly for his education. She heard her own voice find the edge of something, and pulled it back. If the Dawnmere bloodline is what they're after, Finn carries it too. He's the elder child. Yes, Cale said quietly. You already know about him. The dispatch rider brought news from the Highlands. He paused, and in that pause she felt the shape of what was coming before the words arrived. Finn was taken from the Crestfall holding 3 days ago. The elder there reported it as a voluntary departure. The Crestfall Pack doesn't have the standing to contradict a claim made under Elder Prosper's authority. Sadie put her hand flat on the map and breathed. Finn. Finn, who had her father's eyes and their mother's stubbornness, who had taught her to ride, and argued with her about history books, and written her letters every month from the Highlands in his cramped, impatient handwriting. Finn, who had no idea what their bloodline meant, or what had been quietly arranged around them both while they lived their small, ordinary lives in the remnants of their father's diminished estate. "They have him," she said. "Yes." "Where?" Cale pointed to the map, a location in the Northern Highlands, east of the Vane territories, marked with a notation she didn't recognize. "There's a holding there that Prosper controls indirectly, through a proxy pack. It's not on any public record. The Iron Pact has been monitoring it for 8 months as a potential site for unsanctioned ritual activity." He looked at her. "We were already moving toward it before last night. Your situation, and your contract, changes the political complexity of what we can do there." Sadie looked up from the map. "What does the contract change?" "As your recognized mate, I have standing to act on your behalf under Northern Pack law. That gives the Iron Pact legal justification to enter the territory and remove persons held without sanctioned authority." Something in his eyes, precise, careful. "Without that standing, any action we take is an incursion. With it, it's a lawful retrieval." She stared at him. "You were going to that location anyway," she said. "Yes. You knew about Elder Prosper, about the ritual. We've been building a case against him for 8 months. He held her gaze without apology. "I did not know about you specifically until you walked into a burning inn with 37 gold coins and a letter that closed the last gap in our evidence." Sadie was quiet for a long moment, sorting through this. The fire behind them snapped in the wind. Devon moved past at a distance, close enough to be available if needed, far enough to be invisible. She thought about the contract. She thought about coincidence and whether she believed in it. "You agreed very quickly," she said. "Last night. I made the proposal and you agreed within minutes." "Yes, because you already knew the name Vane. You already knew Elder Prosper. And an Omega showing up in the middle of your operation with a witnessed letter and a legal need that conveniently provided your pack with territorial standing." She stopped. "Tell me you weren't calculating it before you agreed." "I was calculating it before you finished speaking," Cale said, without the slightest evasion. Sadie felt a hot surge of something move through her chest. Not quite betrayal. Betrayal required trust, and she had not trusted him. But something adjacent to it. Something that had briefly been reaching toward relief, and had now been redirected. "So I'm useful to you," she said, "the way I was useful to Cedric. Different goal, different method. Still a transaction." Something changed in his face. Not defense, not deflection. Something quieter and more costly. "That is not the same thing," he said. "Isn't it? Cedric was going to kill you." His voice was still level, but underneath the level she heard something that had weight. "I drove through the night to stop a ritual that was going to destroy a bloodline, free a man being held without cause, and hold accountable a council elder who has been engineering pack wars for profit. And yes, you walked into the middle of it, and your legal need aligned with my operational need, and I recognized that, and acted on it." He looked at her directly. "But you are standing here, breathing, with the extract broken down in your blood and your brother's location in your hands and the full weight of the Iron Pact behind your claim. Tell me again how that is the same as what Cedric Vane did to you." The silence between them was different from the silences before. It had texture. Sadie looked at the map, at the marked location in the Highlands, at Finn's name. which she had written herself in the margin beside Cale's finger when he pointed, in the automatic way of someone who needed to make something real by writing it down. "I'm riding with you," she said. "I know," Cale said. "I'm not asking permission." "I know that too." He turned back to the maps. "We leave within the hour. There's food at the main fire, and Devon has secured a better horse than the gray." Sadie looked at him for one more moment. This man who had agreed to a desperate bargain in a burning inn, who had carried broth to her tent in the dark, who had spent the night building her a weapon out of maps and archived documents, and who had, she was slowly understanding, been several steps ahead of her at every point, and had not once made her feel the distance between those steps. She was not going to trust him. She was not going to soften. She was going to ride north with the Alpha King of the Westmarch territories and retrieve her brother and dismantle Elder Prosper's carefully constructed empire of blood and bureaucracy. But she let herself note, privately, and without acting on it in any way, that the anger in her chest was doing something slightly different when he was in the room. She filed that information away and went to find the better horse. The holding was called Greyfen, and it did not look like a prison. That was the point, Sadie understood, as they crested the ridge above it in the cold afternoon light. A working estate, stone walls practical rather than fortified, smoke rising from 2 chimneys, a small paddock with horses that looked well-fed and unhurried. Nothing that would draw a second glance from a traveler on the Highland Road below. Nothing that would suggest, to anyone who did not know to look, that the locked lower wing on the east side of the main building had no windows and received food deliveries 3 times a day for an occupant whose name did not appear in any guest record. Cale had known to look. His men had been watching Greyfen for months, and the intelligence they had assembled was precise. 6 guards rotating in pairs, a proxy packmaster named Aldrich, who answered directly to Elder Prosper, and one held occupant in the east wing who had arrived 3 days ago under restraint and had not been permitted outside since. Finn. Sadie kept her eyes on the building, and her hands steady on the reins of the dark bay horse Devon had found for her. A proper animal, responsive and sure-footed on the highland terrain. Nothing like the gentle gray she had ridden out of the Vane estate the night before. It felt deliberate. Everything around Kyle felt deliberate. She had come to understand over 2 days of riding north. Nothing was careless. Nothing was accidental. Even kindnesses were precise. "The proxy packmaster," she said quietly to Cale beside her. "Aldrich. Is he a true believer or a paid arrangement?" Cale glanced at her. "Paid. Why?" "Because true believers fight. Paid men calculate." She looked at the estate. "If he knows the Iron Pact is here, and the legal standing behind this retrieval is solid, he may choose not to escalate." "He may." "Show him the contract first, before anything else." Cale was quiet for a moment. "You've been thinking about this since we left camp." "I've been thinking about this since I was 12 years old and watched my father lose a land dispute because he arrived with anger instead of paperwork." She met his eyes briefly. Anger is useful. Paperwork wins. Something moved in his expression. That shadow of something that lived near warmth without being soft. He turned to Devon and said quietly, "Contract first. Full Iron Pact Authority Declaration. Give Aldrich the opportunity to stand aside." Devon nodded, as if this had already been his expectation. They rode down. Aldrich stood at the gate and read the contract twice. He was a lean man of middle age, with the watchful eyes of someone who had spent years making calculations about which side of a conflict represented survival. Sadie watched him read it. Watched him absorb Cale's name on the document, and the Iron Pact seal, and the Northern Council stamp from Dora Ashby's office. Watched him understand the architecture of what had been built around him without his knowledge. He stepped aside without a word. His 6 guards followed his lead with the collective instinct of men who were paid to protect property, not principles, and who recognized when the property was no longer worth the cost. The east wing door had a heavy iron lock that one of Cale's men dealt with in under a minute. The corridor beyond was cold and dim, lit by a single torch in a wall bracket, smelling of damp stone and the particular stillness of a space that had been sealed. 3 doors. The second one responded to Sadie's voice before the guard even reached it. A sound from inside, sharp and immediate, the sound of someone who had been waiting in the dark and recognized what they heard. Sadie, muffled through wood and iron. "Sadie, is that... It's me," she said, and her voice broke on the second word, and she let it, just that once. "Stand back from the door." The lock gave. The door opened. Finn was thinner than she remembered, pale from 3 days without sunlight. His dark hair unkempt, and his wrists marked with the chafe of rope recently removed. He was 26 years old, and he looked, for one unguarded moment, very young. Then his eyes found hers, and the expression on his face moved through relief and disbelief, and something else. Something that landed finally on the specific complicated emotion of an older sibling who has been rescued by a younger one, and doesn't entirely know how to hold that. Sadie stepped forward and put her arms around him, and he held on with the force of someone who had spent 3 days not knowing. She did not cry. She had promised herself she wouldn't, and she kept the promise, though it cost her something. She would cry later, privately, when the accounting was done and she could afford it. For now she held her brother, and breathed, and felt the last frayed edge of the night she had fled the Vane estate finally knot itself into something she could carry. When she stepped back, Finn's eyes had moved past her to Cale, standing in the corridor doorway. Something shifted in Finn's expression. Recognition, or the particular wariness of someone encountering a force they had only heard about from a careful distance. "Finn Wren," Cale said. Not a question. "Yes," Finn said, and then, because he was Finn, and had never in his life been able to suppress the thing he was thinking, "You're the Alpha King." "Yes." Finn looked at Sadie. "How?" "I'll explain on the way," she said. "Can you ride?" "Yes." "Then we're leaving." They did not return to the camp. Kyle redirected them east, toward the Iron Pack's primary northern stronghold, a fortified estate called Ironhaven that sat on the border of the West March territories and the Northern Highlands, 3 hours' ride from Greyfen, and which turned out to be considerably less military and considerably more architectural than the word stronghold had led Sadie to imagine. Stone and timber, high windows, a great hall that smelled of pine and beeswax, fires in every room, and the organized hum of a working seat of power. She had 2 days there before the council convened. Kyle's legal team, 3 sharp-eyed men and 1 woman named Sarah, who moved through the stronghold's library like she owned it, spent those 2 days assembling the case. The letter from Sadie's wedding night, the iron-packed archive records on the Dawnmere bloodline, 8 months of surveillance documentation on Elder Prosper, and the proxy holding at Greyfen, Finn's testimony, given in writing and then again verbally, about his abduction and confinement, the contract from Dora Ashby's office, the pack physician's records from the Vane estate, obtained through channels Sadie did not ask about, confirming the presence of night bloom extract in the ceremonial wine set. Cedric Vane's name appeared on those records, his handwriting, his order. Sarah laid the documents in front of Sadie the night before the council and said, with the quiet satisfaction of someone who loved her work, "There is no version of tomorrow in which they walk away from this." Sadie read through everything twice. She slept for 7 hours and woke up calm. The Northern Council chamber had high stone walls and long windows that looked out over the Highland ridgeline. 12 seats around a carved oak table. Elder Prosper sat in his customary chair at the far end and looked at Sadie when she entered with the expression of a man reassessing a situation he had believed resolved. Cedric Vane sat 2 seats to the left. He looked at her the way someone looks at a ghost, with the particular horror of the person who made them one. Sadie sat across from them and folded her hands on the table and said nothing. Cale took the seat at the head of the council. He had not told her he would do that. She had assumed he would sit to the side, as a supporting authority. Instead, he sat at the head of the table with the absolute unhurried ease of someone whose right to that position had never been questioned, and the room reorganized itself around him the way rooms always did, and the two men at the far end of the table became, visibly, smaller. Sarah presented the case. She was precise, thorough, and entirely without theater, which made it more devastating, not less. Each document placed on the table was a stone added to a weight that both men could see accumulating and could not stop. Elder Prosper attempted an interruption twice, and was silenced both times with the specific, quiet authority of someone who had anticipated the interruption and prepared for it. Cedric said nothing. He had understood, Sadie thought, before Sarah had finished the first document. He was a calculating man. He could read a room. He sat with his hands flat on the table and his jaw set, and the look of someone watching the structure of everything he had built come apart, and knowing that no amount of will could reassemble it in time. When Sarah finished, the chamber was silent. "Cedric Vane," Kyle said. His voice filled the room without effort, the way a stone fills water, displacing everything around it. "You are charged with attempted murder through deliberate poisoning, illegal acquisition of a protected bloodline through coerced contract, and conspiracy to conduct an unsanctioned ritual transfer under Iron Pact jurisdiction. Do you contest any element of the documentation presented?" Cedric looked at Sadie. For a long moment, he just looked at her. And in that look she found, with some surprise, no hatred. What she found was something almost like defeat, which was worse in a different way, because it meant he had never truly seen her as a person worth hating. She had been a resource. The look on his face was the look of a man mourning a lost investment. She held his gaze and felt nothing move in her chest except the clean, steady burning of someone who knew exactly where she stood. "No," Cedric said quietly. "I don't contest it." Elder Prosper contested everything loudly for nearly 20 minutes, and it changed nothing. The documentation was complete. The council votes were taken. Both men were stripped of pack authority and territorial holdings pending formal tribunal, their assets frozen under Iron Pact oversight, their movements restricted to council-monitored grounds. Prosper's drafted ritual law was struck from the Northern Record permanently. It took less than an hour. Sadie had waited her whole life for justice, and it arrived quietly, in a room that smelled of old wood and lamp oil, in the form of 12 votes and a sealed document, and 2 men who left the chamber flanked by Iron Pact guards, and did not look back. She found Cale in the Stronghold library that evening. He was at the large table near the window reading, not reviewing documents, not studying maps, just a book held in one hand, and the fire at his back, and the highland dark pressing against the glass outside. He looked, for the first time since she had known him, like a man who was not in the middle of something. She sat in the chair across the table and was quiet for a moment. "It's done," she said. "Yes." "Finn is free. The bloodline transfer can never be completed. Prosper's law is struck. Cedric is finished." She ran through it methodically, the way she had learned to process things, out loud, in order, so the weight of them could become real and then become manageable. "Yes," Cale said again. He set the book down. He looked at her with that steady, unhurried gaze that she had stopped trying to deflect approximately 48 hours ago. "I need to talk to you about the contract," she said. Something in his expression became very still. "I know what I proposed," she said. "A business arrangement. Mutual dissolution by agreement after the immediate need was resolved." She held his gaze. "The immediate need is resolved. You are entitled to consider the arrangement complete." Kyle said nothing. He waited, in the way that was entirely characteristic of him. Not passive waiting, but the active, present waiting of someone who was listening to everything, including what had not been said yet. "I don't want to dissolve it," Sadie said. The fire shifted behind him. Outside, the Highland wind moved across the stone of the stronghold, and somewhere in the corridor, Finn's voice rose briefly in conversation with Davon, and then faded. "I'm not asking you to feel something you don't feel," she said. "I'm not confusing gratitude for whatever this is. I know the difference between a man who helped me because I was useful and a man who—" She stopped, restarted. "You came to the tent with broth. You didn't have to do that. You spent the night building me a legal case. You put me in the council chamber with everything I needed. You let me be part of the plan instead of the subject of it." She looked at her hands, then back at him. "I have spent my entire adult life being managed by people who called it care. I know what management feels like. That was not what that was." Kyle rose from his chair and crossed to her side of the table, and crouched down in front of her so their eyes were level, and she was so surprised by the gesture. This man, this immovable, authoritative, unreadable man, making himself small so she didn't have to look up. That whatever composure she had been maintaining cracked straight down the middle. "I felt the bond the night you signed the contract," he said quietly. "I didn't tell you because you had been poisoned and your trust had been destroyed, and you needed a partner, not a claim." His eyes held hers, and in them she saw something she recognized now. All the things his still face had been containing since a burning inn in Asheville. "I have been waiting for you to be ready. I will keep waiting if you need more time. But I will not dissolve the contract, Sadie. Not because of the bloodline, not because of the law. Because you walked into the worst night of your life, and you were furious and clear and you did not break, and I have not stopped thinking about it since." She did not cry. She had promised herself she wouldn't. She put her hand against his jaw, and he turned his face into it slightly, just slightly, like something that had been holding itself apart finally allowing contact, and that small motion undid her more completely than anything else could have. "All right," she said. It was not a grand declaration. It was not a speech. It was just the word, spoken quietly in a library that smelled of old paper and wood smoke, and it was entirely sufficient. They were married again 6 weeks later, properly this time, in the great hall of Ironhaven, with Finn standing beside Sadie and Davon beside Cale and Dora Ashby in the front row, because Cale had sent a carriage for her, and she had arrived with her ledger and her practical braid, and the expression of a woman who intended to witness this one with full attention. The ceremony was simple. Sadie wore deep green wool and her mother's pearl pins in her hair, and when Cale took her hands at the altar, his grip was steady and warm, and she did not feel, for the first time in as long as she could remember, the need to prepare for what came next. The bond completed itself quietly, like something that had already known and had only been waiting for the room to catch up. In the months that followed, the Northern Territories reorganized under Iron Pact oversight. The six-pack lands that Cedric and Prosper had intended to consolidate under manufactured authority were instead returned to their rightful packmasters, their border disputes adjudicated fairly. Sadie sat on that arbitration council as the holder of the Dawnmere bloodline, and she was precise and thorough and entirely without theater, and the council listened. Finn returned to the Highlands and took up stewardship of the Crestfall holding properly, with Iron Pact recognition and a letter of formal status that he read 3 times, and then folded into his coat with the expression of a man who had not entirely expected his life to resolve this well. Cedric Vane stood before the full tribunal, and was stripped of all remaining holdings and exiled beyond the Eastern Territories. He did not look at Sadie during the sentencing. She looked at him. She wanted him to know she was there, not from cruelty, but because she had decided that invisible women were a thing she was finished with, and she intended him to carry the image of her face for the remainder of his years. Elder Prosper, confronted with the full weight of 8 months of documented evidence, and a tribunal with no patience for procedural delay, confessed to 7 counts of conspiracy and 2 counts of ritual law manipulation. He was held in Iron Pact custody indefinitely. He did not seem, in the end, like a monster. He seemed like a small man who had wanted a great deal and had not cared what he broke to get it. Sadie found that almost more disturbing than if he had been monstrous. It was easier to hate what was large. She found eventually that she did not need to hate him at all. She needed to make sure he could never do it again. Those were different projects, and only one of them was worth her time. On a clear night in late spring, Sadie stood at the high window of the Ironhaven Library, with the Highland wind coming in cold through the glass and the stars very bright above the ridgeline. She could feel Cale behind her before she heard him. The bond had that quality now, a warm peripheral awareness that she had stopped resisting and started simply inhabiting. He came to stand beside her, and they looked out at the dark highlands together, at the land that was hers by blood and his by pact and theirs by choice. She thought about the woman who had stood in a Vane estate corridor 6 months ago with a broken seal and a cooling cup of poisoned wine, making the calculations of someone with nothing left to lose. She did not feel sorry for that woman. She felt something fiercer than pity and gentler than pride, something that had no exact word, but that lived in the chest like a steady fire, like the kind that did not consume itself. She had not survived to return to who she had been before. She had survived to become someone the before version of herself would not have known how to imagine. "You're thinking loudly," Kyle said. "I'm allowed," she said. "It's my library." She felt him smile more than she saw it. He put his hand over hers on the windowsill, and she turned her hand to meet his. And outside, the Highland dark held its long, quiet breath, and the story that had begun in a burning inn with 37 gold coins and a desperate bargain settled into something that needed no more words. It was done, all of it, and what remained was entirely, permanently theirs.